My name is Clara Bennett. I'm 52 years old. For the last 4 years, I've cleaned houses in some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Connecticut. Most people think cleaning is about dust. It isn't. It's about noticing things. You learn a lot when people stop seeing you. You learn who fights when guests leave. You learn which marriages are real and which ones only exist for photographs. You learn that expensive houses hide secrets just as well as cheap ones, sometimes better. Before I became a cleaner, I worked in hospital administration. I spent nearly 20 years processing records, organizing files, and dealing with paperwork that most people never saw. I wasn't a doctor. I wasn't a nurse. But I learned something important. Every problem leaves traces, even when people try to hide them, especially when they try to hide them. After my divorce, my life changed completely. My husband had invested in a business that failed. The debts swallowed everything. The savings disappeared. The plans disappeared. The future I thought I had disappeared. I was 48 years old and starting over. Not many people talk about what that feels like. Starting over at 20 is exciting. Starting over at almost 50 is terrifying. So I took the first stable job I could find, cleaning houses. At first, I told myself it was temporary. Then months became years, and eventually I realized something. People underestimate cleaners, and that makes us dangerous observers. 3 years ago, my agency assigned me to the Harrington estate. Everyone in town knew the name. The Harringtons weren't celebrities. They were richer than celebrities. Old money, investment firms, trust funds, board memberships. The kind of family that appeared in charity magazines. The kind of family people described as perfect. The house sat behind black iron gates on a hill overlooking the water. The driveway curved through perfectly trimmed trees. The lawn looked like it had never seen a weed. The first time I arrived, I remember sitting in my car for a moment before getting out. Not because I was impressed, because the place felt strangely quiet. Almost too quiet. The front door opened before I reached it. A woman stood there. Elegant, perfectly dressed, perfect posture, perfect smile. Mrs. Evelyn Harrington. She introduced herself politely, showed me around, explained where supplies were stored. Then she thanked me and disappeared upstairs. That was the longest conversation we ever had. After that day, she barely acknowledged my existence, not because she was rude, because people like Evelyn Harrington never learned to notice people like me. I was part of the furniture, part of the background, a moving appliance, and honestly, I preferred it that way. Her husband, Richard Harrington, was different, friendly, too friendly, always smiling, always asking how my day was, always remembering my name. Some people think kindness is always genuine. Years of working around people taught me otherwise. Sometimes friendliness is just another performance. Their son Andrew was 17, quiet, reserved, the kind of teenager who spent more time alone than with his family. Whenever I saw him, he was wearing headphones, walking quickly, avoiding eye contact. He seemed lonely, though at the time I couldn't explain why. For the first several months, nothing unusual happened. I cleaned, I left, I got paid. Simple. Then small things started appearing. A document left on a desk. A folder quickly closed when someone entered a room. Phone calls ending the moment footsteps approached. None of it meant anything individually, but together they formed a pattern. And patterns are difficult for me to ignore. One Tuesday evening, I was cleaning the upstairs hallway. Richard was inside his study. The door was closed, locked as usual. I wasn't trying to listen. I never do. But large houses carry sound in strange ways. Sometimes a whisper travels farther than a shout. I heard Richard speaking on the phone. His voice was calm, businesslike. Then I heard something that made me stop. Once the trust is activated, she won't have access anymore. Silence. Then another sentence. She doesn't need to know until everything is finalized. I froze. The vacuum cleaner continued humming in my hands, but my attention shifted completely. A trust. No access. She doesn't need to know. Those weren't ordinary words, not in a house like this, not from a man like Richard Harrington. I stood there for another few seconds. Then he lowered his voice. I couldn't hear the rest. When I finally moved again, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd heard. Who was he talking about? Who was losing access? And why wasn't that person supposed to know? That night I drove home under heavy rain. The windshield wipers moved back and forth while those words repeated in my mind. She doesn't need to know. By the time I parked outside my apartment, I realized something. For the first time since I started working there, I wasn't thinking about cleaning. I was thinking about the Harrington family, and I had the uncomfortable feeling that something inside that perfect house wasn't right. I just didn't know how wrong it really was. Not yet. Part 2. The next morning, I tried to convince myself I was overthinking. People say strange things on business calls all the time. Maybe I had misunderstood. Maybe I had only heard part of the conversation. Maybe it had nothing to do with Evelyn. But the longer I thought about it, the less convinced I became. Something felt wrong. And once a feeling like that settles into your mind, it doesn't leave easily. The following Tuesday, I arrived at the Harrington estate at exactly 8 in the morning. The weather was clear. The house looked exactly as it always did. Beautiful, quiet, perfect, too perfect. I parked, grabbed my supplies, and walked inside. Evelyn wasn't home. Richard wasn't home. Only Andrew. I found him sitting alone in the kitchen. He was staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. For a teenager, he looked unusually tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. His shoulders seemed tense, like he hadn't slept. He looked up when I entered. "Morning, Clara." "Morning." Then he looked back down. Normally our conversations lasted no more than 10 seconds. But that day he suddenly asked a question. "Do you ever feel like people can live in the same house and not know each other at all?" I stopped wiping the counter. It wasn't the kind of question teenagers usually ask a cleaner. I looked at him. He wasn't joking. He genuinely wanted an answer. "Sometimes," I said. He nodded slowly, as if I had confirmed something he already knew. Then he stood up and left. I watched him disappear upstairs. The kitchen suddenly felt colder. That conversation stayed with me all morning, because people don't ask questions like that unless something is already broken. Around noon, I started cleaning Richard's study. The room was empty. Sunlight came through the large windows. Everything appeared normal. Desk, bookshelves, leather chair, family photographs. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed a folder, dark blue, half hidden beneath several financial magazines. At first, I ignored it. I wasn't there to investigate anyone's life. I was there to clean. But as I moved the magazines to dust underneath them, the folder slid open, only slightly, just enough for me to see a name. Evelyn Harrington. I froze. The conversation from the previous week immediately returned to my mind. She won't have access anymore. I should have closed the folder and walked away. Instead, I glanced down. 1 second, maybe 2. That was all it took. The document wasn't a will. It wasn't a divorce filing. It wasn't a business contract. It was something much stranger, a trust amendment. And Evelyn's name appeared only once, near the bottom, not as a beneficiary, not as an owner, not as a decision-maker. Her name appeared under a section labeled Current Interested Party, nothing else. I didn't understand all the legal language, but I understood enough. Whoever controlled the trust controlled the money, and Evelyn clearly wasn't controlling anything. I closed the folder immediately. My heart was beating faster now, because I knew something most people don't understand. Wealthy families rarely fight about emotions. They fight about control. Money is control. Assets are control. Information is control. And somebody inside that house was moving pieces around, quietly, carefully, behind closed doors. The rest of the afternoon felt different. Every interaction suddenly carried more meaning. Every glance seemed important. Every silence seemed intentional. When Richard returned home later that evening, he looked completely relaxed, smiling, friendly, the same man everyone admired, the same man who sat on charity boards and donated to hospitals, the same man who probably appeared trustworthy to everyone who met him. But now I kept hearing those words, "She doesn't need to know." As I cleaned the dining room, I heard voices coming from the library, Richard and Evelyn. Their conversation sounded calm, at first. Then I heard Evelyn ask something. I couldn't make out every word, only one sentence. "Why can't I see the statements anymore?" Silence. Then Richard answered. "They're being consolidated." A pause. "Consolidated where?" Another pause. Longer this time. Then Richard laughed softly, not naturally, not comfortably. It sounded rehearsed. "You're worrying about things that don't matter." I heard nothing for several seconds. Then footsteps, fast footsteps. Evelyn walked past the dining room. She wasn't crying, but she looked angry and confused. The expression stayed on her face long after she disappeared upstairs. That was the moment something changed for me. Until then, everything had been suspicion, fragments, possibilities. But now I knew one thing for certain. Evelyn was asking questions, questions Richard didn't want to answer. And when someone starts hiding answers inside a marriage, the real story is usually much bigger than anyone realizes. That evening, before leaving, I emptied the trash bins throughout the house, a routine task, one I had done hundreds of times. Then I reached Richard's study. Most days the bin contained shredded notes, receipts, meeting agendas. Nothing interesting. That day was different. Mixed among the papers was a torn envelope. Most of it was missing. Only one corner remained, but one line was still visible. I read it twice, then a third time, because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The sender was a law firm in New York, and beneath their logo were 5 words. Regarding transfer of beneficiary rights. Transfer, beneficiary, rights. 3 words that should never appear casually. Especially not in the same week as secret trust documents. I placed the paper back exactly where I found it. Then I left. Driving home, I realized something that made me deeply uncomfortable. The Harrington family wasn't dealing with a future problem. Whatever was happening had already started. And if I was right, Evelyn Harrington was the last person in that house to realize it. What I didn't know was that only 3 days later, I would discover something far worse than hidden financial documents. Something that would make me question whether Richard Harrington was planning more than just taking control of the money. Much more. The next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the trust documents. Not because I was curious, because the pieces were starting to connect. And when pieces start connecting, you either look away or keep going. I've never been very good at looking away. The following Friday, I arrived at the Harrington estate earlier than usual. The house was unusually quiet. No music, no television, no voices, just silence, the kind of silence that feels deliberate. I started cleaning the second floor. Around 10 in the morning, I noticed Evelyn leaving her bedroom. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I realized she looked exhausted, not physically, mentally. She walked slowly down the hallway, carrying a folder against her chest. For a moment, our eyes met. Something about her expression stopped me. She looked worried, not the kind of worry that comes from stress, the kind that comes from confusion, as if she was trying to solve a problem that no longer made sense. She nodded politely and continued downstairs. A few minutes later, I entered the bedroom to change the linens. The room was immaculate, almost untouched. Then I noticed something near the sitting area by the window. A single sheet of paper had slipped from the folder Evelyn had been carrying. It was lying partially under a chair. I should have ignored it. But when I bent down to pick it up, a few words immediately caught my attention. Medical evaluation, patient assessment, cognitive observation. I froze. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. The document appeared recent, very recent, and the patient name printed at the top was Evelyn Harrington. My heart sank. because suddenly the trust documents made a lot more sense. I wasn't looking at financial paperwork anymore. I was looking at something much bigger, something far more dangerous. The evaluation itself wasn't alarming. In fact, it said the exact opposite. The doctor had noted that Evelyn showed no significant cognitive impairment, no memory issues, no signs of dementia, no signs of reduced decision-making ability. Everything appeared normal, which immediately raised a question. Why was she being evaluated at all? I carefully placed the paper back where I found it, but my mind was already racing. Then another possibility entered my head, one I didn't like, not even a little. What if someone wanted documentation, not because she was sick, because they wanted to claim she was? That afternoon, Richard returned home earlier than usual. I was dusting shelves in the upstairs hallway when I heard raised voices below, not shouting, but louder than normal. I moved carefully toward the staircase. Again, I wasn't trying to listen, but the house seemed determined to tell me things. "I already did the evaluation," Evelyn said. Her voice sounded frustrated. "You said that would answer the questions. It does answer them," Richard replied. "Then why are there more forms?" Silence. Then Richard spoke again. His tone was calm, too calm. "The attorneys are simply being cautious." Attorneys, not doctors. Attorneys. That single word changed everything. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded smaller, less confident. "I don't understand why this is happening." Neither did I, but I was beginning to suspect. Later that day, while cleaning a guest bedroom, I saw Andrew sitting alone on the back patio. The house overlooked the water. Most people would have admired the view. Andrew wasn't looking at it. He was staring at the ground. I stepped outside to empty a trash bin. As I passed him, he suddenly spoke. "My mom thinks she's losing her mind." I stopped, slowly. "What do you mean?" He laughed, a bitter laugh, the kind adults usually make, not teenagers. "My dad keeps telling her she forgets things." He looked toward the house, then back at me. "But she doesn't." I said nothing. Andrew continued. "At first she believed him." His jaw tightened. "Now I think she's starting to realize something." A cold feeling moved through me, because I had seen this before, not in wealthy houses, in hospitals. A person hears something often enough and eventually starts questioning themselves. Did I forget? Did I misunderstand? Maybe they're right. Maybe something is wrong with me. It's a frightening thing to watch happen, especially when it's intentional. Andrew stood up. For a second, he looked like he wanted to say more. Then he stopped himself. I shouldn't have said anything. And just like that, he walked back inside, leaving me alone on the patio. That night, I barely slept, because for the first time, I believed I understood what was happening. This wasn't about money alone. Money was only the reward. Control was the objective. If Evelyn could be convinced she was incapable of managing her own affairs, if attorneys could be convinced, if a court could be convinced, then someone else could legally take control, not by stealing, not by force, by paperwork. The cleanest theft in the world, the kind that looks completely legal, the kind that leaves almost no fingerprints. The next Monday, something happened that removed all remaining doubt. I arrived at the house and found Richard's study unlocked. For the first time since I had started working there. The door stood slightly open. Inside, no one was home. No Richard, no Evelyn, no Andrew, just silence. And on the desk sat a thick manila folder. The top page was clearly visible. I only needed 1 second to read the title, Petition for Guardianship Review, and beneath it was a name, Evelyn Harrington. At that moment, I realized the situation was far worse than I had imagined. Richard wasn't considering the possibility. He wasn't exploring options. He had already started the process. And if I was right, Evelyn Harrington had no idea how close she was to losing control of her own life. The following Monday should have been an ordinary workday. Instead, It became the day everything changed. I arrived at the Harrington estate just before 8 in the morning. A light fog hung over the property. The house looked exactly the same as always. Beautiful, expensive, untouchable. But I no longer saw it that way. Now I saw a puzzle, and every room seemed to contain another missing piece. Richard wasn't home, neither was Evelyn. Andrew's car was gone. For the first time in months, I had the entire house to myself. I started upstairs, bathrooms first, then bedrooms, then the guest wing. Around 10 o'clock, I reached Richard's study. The door was closed. Not unusual, but something immediately caught my attention. A faint electronic hum. Barely audible. I would have missed it if I hadn't spent 20 years working around medical equipment. Machines have sounds, different sounds, predictable sounds, and this was definitely coming from inside the room. I hesitated, then continued working. An hour later, I returned. The hum was still there. Curiosity finally won. The study door wasn't locked. That alone was unusual. Richard always locked it. Always. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room looked normal. Bookshelves, desk, leather chair, family photographs, everything exactly where it should be. Then I heard the sound again, a soft vibration, almost like a tiny motor. I followed it. The noise led me toward a bookshelf near the fireplace. I leaned closer and froze. Hidden between two decorative books was a miniature camera, no larger than a golf ball, pointed directly toward the center of the room. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Then I slowly stepped backward. My pulse quickened. One hidden camera could have meant anything. Security, monitoring, paranoia. But something told me to keep looking. 10 minutes later, I found a second camera, then a third. One in the study, one in the upstairs hallway, one facing the family room. Not security cameras, not visible cameras, hidden cameras, the kind designed not to be noticed. I suddenly remembered Andrew's words. My mom thinks she's losing her mind. A cold feeling settled into my stomach, because I was beginning to understand. Someone wasn't simply watching the house. Someone was collecting evidence. That afternoon, I couldn't focus. Every room felt different. Every interaction felt staged. Every conversation felt like part of something larger. Around 3 o'clock, Evelyn returned home. She looked exhausted again, more exhausted than before. As she entered the kitchen, she opened a cabinet and stood motionless for several seconds, just staring. Then she quietly closed it. I watched from the other side of the room. Nothing unusual, except Richard walked in immediately afterward, almost as if he had been waiting. You forgot where the glasses were again? Evelyn looked confused. No. Yes, you did. No, Richard, I was looking for tea. He smiled, a calm smile. Patient, understanding, the kind of smile people use when they want others to think they're helping. If you say so, then he walked away. Evelyn remained standing there, silent, and for the first time I saw doubt in her eyes. Not doubt about him, doubt about herself. That was when I understood the real danger. The goal wasn't proving she was confused. The goal was making her believe she was confused, over and over, day after day, until she stopped trusting her own memory. The next morning, something happened that confirmed my worst fears. I was cleaning the upstairs hallway when I noticed a maintenance technician entering the study. I had never seen him before. He carried a black equipment case, the kind used for electronics. Richard arrived a few minutes later. The study door closed. Normally, I would have ignored it. But as I passed the room, I heard voices. The technician sounded concerned. I'm not sure we're supposed to be recording this much, Richard answered immediately. Just make sure everything is backed up. Backed up. The word hit me instantly. Recordings. The cameras. The files. The evidence. The technician lowered his voice. Some of these clips don't really show anything. Richard laughed softly. They don't need to. Then came a sentence I will never forget. We only need enough to create a pattern. I stopped walking. Every instinct told me to leave. Instead, I stood perfectly still, heart pounding, listening. The technician spoke again. "You really think the court will accept it?" Richard's answer came without hesitation. "The attorneys think it's more than enough." Court, attorneys, pattern. The pieces finally connected. Someone was collecting hundreds of hours of footage, not to document reality, to manufacture a narrative that Evelyn was forgetful, confused, unstable. The study door suddenly opened. I moved instantly, back toward the hallway, back to my cleaning cart. By the time Richard stepped outside, I was dusting a table. He smiled. The same friendly smile, the same smile everyone trusted. "Morning, Clara. Morning." For the first time since meeting him, I struggled to return the smile, because now I knew something terrifying. Richard Harrington wasn't trying to prove his wife was incapable. He was building a case designed to convince everyone else. And if he succeeded, Evelyn wouldn't just lose control of the money. She could lose control of her entire life. But the biggest shock was still waiting. 2 days later, I would discover a recording Richard never intended anyone else to hear. And once I heard it, there would be no doubt about what he was really after. For the next 2 days, I couldn't stop thinking about the cameras. Not because they existed, because of what Richard had said. "We only need enough to create a pattern." The sentence replayed in my mind constantly. A pattern, not the truth. A pattern. There is a difference. The truth is what happened. A pattern is what someone wants other people to believe happened. And Richard Harrington seemed determined to create one. By Thursday morning, I had convinced myself to stay out of it. I was a house cleaner, not a lawyer, not a detective, not a family counselor. Whatever was happening inside that house wasn't my responsibility. That was what I told myself. Then everything changed. Around 11 o'clock, a delivery truck arrived. A young driver brought several boxes addressed to Richard. No one was home. That wasn't unusual. Deliveries were left with household staff all the time. The driver asked me to place the boxes inside the study. I hesitated, then carried them in. The room looked ordinary. Desk, books, computer monitors. Nothing unusual, until I noticed something strange. One of the monitors was still on. A black screen filled with file names. Hundreds of file names, dates, times, room locations, hallway, kitchen, living room, master bedroom entrance. My stomach tightened, the camera recordings. I should have looked away. Instead, I glanced at the screen, just long enough to notice a folder near the top. LZ Goal Review. Another folder beneath it. EVLIN Observations. Then a third. Court Preparation. I felt a chill move through me. Court preparation. This wasn't a possibility anymore. This was a plan. A real plan. A plan already in motion. I placed the boxes beside the desk and turned to leave. Then I heard something. A voice, coming from one of the speakers. Someone had left an audio file open. At first I assumed it was a mistake, then I recognized Richard's voice. I froze. The recording had already started. I only heard part of the conversation, but it was enough. Richard was speaking with someone. A man, most likely an attorney. The attorney sounded cautious. "The medical evaluations don't support incapacity," Richard answered immediately. "They don't need to." A pause. Then the attorney spoke again. "If this goes before a judge, she'll need to appear impaired." Richard laughed quietly. A cold laugh, the kind that contains no humor at all. "Leave that to me." My heart began pounding. I knew I should leave. I knew I shouldn't be listening, but I couldn't move. The attorney continued. "The trust is worth approximately $18 million. $18 million. I nearly stopped breathing. Not hundreds of thousands, not 1 or 2 million. 18 million. Suddenly everything made sense. The cameras, the evaluations, the paperwork, the pressure, the manipulation. The trust wasn't simply wealth, it was control of an empire. Richard spoke again. If Evelyn loses authority, everything transfers exactly where we need it. The attorney hesitated. And Andrew? A longer silence followed. Then Richard answered. Andrew doesn't need to be involved. Those words hit me harder than anything else. Not because of the money, because of Andrew, his own son. Excluded, dismissed, like an obstacle. The attorney sounded uncomfortable. That could become complicated. Richard's voice hardened instantly. Then don't make it complicated. The recording ended. The room fell silent. I stood completely motionless, trying to process what I had just heard. For weeks, I had suspected something was wrong. Now I knew. Richard wasn't protecting family assets. He wasn't helping Evelyn. He wasn't planning for the future. He was positioning himself to take control of $18 million. And if that required convincing everyone that his wife was mentally incapable, he was willing to do it. I left the study immediately. My hands were shaking. For the first time since I started working there, I felt afraid. Not for myself, for Evelyn, because she had no idea how close the trap was becoming. The next day brought another surprise, one I never expected. I arrived shortly after 8. Andrew was already home, sitting alone in the kitchen. Again, the same tired expression, the same dark circles beneath his eyes. As I entered, he looked up. Then he did something unexpected. He asked me to sit down. I almost laughed. No employer's son had ever asked me to sit down before, but something in his face told me this mattered. So I sat. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "What is this?" I asked. "I found it in my dad's office." I unfolded it carefully. It was a draft document, incomplete, but readable. My stomach dropped immediately. The title read, Proposed Transfer of Trustee Authority. Below it appeared several names: Richard Harrington, various attorneys, financial advisors, and one notable absence, Evelyn Harrington. Her name wasn't listed anywhere, not once. I looked up. Andrew nodded slowly. "I think he's trying to remove her." The room felt suddenly smaller. "Does your mother know?" "No." The answer came instantly, too instantly. Andrew had already asked himself the same question many times. "What are you going to do?" He looked toward the window, toward the water beyond the estate. For a moment he looked much older than 17. Then he answered, "I don't know." That was the truth. I could hear it, because the situation was impossible. If he accused his father without proof, no one would believe him. If he stayed silent, his mother could lose everything. And every day that passed made Richard stronger. The paperwork moved forward. The recordings accumulated. The story was being written, not the true story, Richard's story. And unless something changed soon, everyone, including the court, might believe it. What neither of us knew was that the biggest mistake Richard Harrington would make was about to happen. A mistake so careless, so arrogant, that it would ultimately destroy everything he had spent months building. And it would begin with a single email sent to the wrong person. The mistake happened on a Tuesday. For months, Richard Harrington had been careful. Careful with documents. Careful with conversations. Careful with appearances. That was why nobody suspected him. That was why his plan had worked for so long. But people who spend months controlling every detail eventually start believing they can't make mistakes, and that belief is usually the beginning of the end. I arrived at the Harrington estate shortly before 9 in the morning. The atmosphere inside the house felt different, tense, unusually tense. Richard was in his study. Evelyn was upstairs. Andrew sat at the kitchen table pretending to do homework. Nobody seemed comfortable. Around 10 o'clock, I heard raised voices, not shouting, but louder than normal. Richard rarely lost control of his emotions. That morning he sounded angry, very angry. A few minutes later, he stormed out of his study carrying his phone. The study door remained open, for the second time in a month. That alone told me something had gone wrong. I continued working. An hour later, Andrew found me in the laundry room. His face was pale. Something happened. I immediately knew it was serious. What happened? My dad sent an email to the wrong person. I stared at him. What kind of email? Andrew swallowed hard, the kind he wasn't supposed to send. Then he handed me his phone. The screen displayed a forwarded message. According to Andrew, Richard had intended to send it to one of his attorneys. Instead, he accidentally sent it to Evelyn, his wife, the very person he had been trying to control. I looked at the message. My heart began racing because the email wasn't vague. It wasn't indirect. It wasn't open to interpretation. It was devastating. The subject line read, "Final Guardianship Strategy." Below it was a detailed discussion between Richard and his legal team, medical evaluations, trust control, court timelines, video evidence, everything, every piece of the plan, laid out in plain language. Then I reached a sentence that made my stomach turn. If the judge accepts diminished capacity, transfer authority immediately before Andrew becomes involved. I read it twice, then a third time, because there it was, the truth. Richard wasn't protecting the family. He wasn't protecting Evelyn. He wasn't protecting anyone. He was protecting his access to $18 million. And now Evelyn had the proof. The entire day passed in silence. No one spoke much. No one smiled. No one pretended everything was normal, because for the first time, Richard's secret wasn't a secret anymore. At 4 o'clock, Evelyn asked Andrew to come upstairs. An hour later, she left the house. Not alone. Andrew went with her. They didn't return until nearly midnight. The following morning, everything exploded. Not publicly, not dramatically, legally. Exactly the way people like Richard fight their wars. Through attorneys, through evidence, through paperwork. By noon, Evelyn had hired independent counsel, not Richard's attorneys, her own. By Friday, every document Richard had prepared was under review. Every recording, every petition, every financial transfer, every communication, everything. The attorneys moved fast, much faster than Richard expected. Because once they saw the email, the entire situation changed. Suddenly the question was no longer whether Evelyn was capable. The question became whether Richard had intentionally tried to manipulate the legal system. That is a very different question, and a very dangerous one. 3 weeks later, the hearing took place. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Evelyn invited me, not as a witness, not as evidence, as a friend. That surprised me more than anything. For years I had been invisible. Now she wanted me there. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Simple, quiet, professional. Richard sat with his attorneys. Evelyn sat beside Andrew. Neither looked at the other. The judge reviewed documents for nearly 2 hours. Medical evaluations, financial records, emails, video archives, expert opinions. Then came the accidental email. The room changed immediately. Even from the back row, I could feel it. The judge read several sections silently, then removed his glasses. A gesture I will never forget. Because judges don't usually show emotion, this one did. Not anger, disappointment. The hearing ended shortly afterward. The decision came the following week. The guardianship petition was denied, completely. The court found no evidence that Evelyn lacked the ability to manage her own affairs. None. The trust remained under her authority. The recordings were dismissed as unreliable. Several legal filings prepared by Richard's team were withdrawn. An investigation into certain actions surrounding the case was recommended. Just like that, months of planning collapsed. Not because of some brilliant legal strategy, because the truth finally reached the right person. Richard moved out 2 months later. The divorce proceedings began shortly afterward. I won't pretend I know everything that happened after that. Families are complicated. Even after the truth comes out, maybe especially after the truth comes out. What I do know is this: Evelyn changed. The woman who once moved through the house like a guest in her own life became someone else, someone stronger, someone who trusted herself again. The doubt disappeared, the hesitation disappeared, the fear disappeared. One afternoon, several months later, she invited me for coffee, not to clean, not to work, just coffee. We sat on the back patio overlooking the water, the same patio where so many secrets had quietly grown. She looked at me and smiled, a real smile this time, not the practice smile she used to wear, the kind that reaches a person's eyes. "You know what the worst part was?" she asked. I shook my head. I almost believed him. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she laughed softly. Imagine that. I trusted everyone except myself. I understood exactly what she meant, because that's how manipulation works. It doesn't start by controlling your money. It starts by controlling your confidence, your memory, your judgment, your belief in yourself. Once those things disappear, everything else becomes easier to take. The Harrington estate was eventually sold. Andrew left for college the following year. Evelyn moved to a smaller waterfront home about 20 minutes away. She said she wanted peace, not space, peace. And honestly, after everything she survived, I think she earned it. As for me, I still clean houses. I still notice things. I still believe every problem leaves traces. But the Harrington family taught me something I never forgot. The most dangerous theft isn't when someone takes what's in your bank account. It's when someone slowly convinces you that you no longer have the right to control your own life. And if someone ever starts making you doubt your own mind, your own memory, or your own judgment, pay attention, because the people who want power rarely announce it. They whisper, they document, they prepare, and they hope you'll stop trusting yourself before you realize what's happening. Evelyn Harrington almost did. Almost. But sometimes all it takes is one mistake, one email, one piece of truth, and an entire lie comes crashing down. That's my story, and after everything I witnessed inside that house, I learned one lesson that I will carry for the rest of my life. Never let someone else tell you who you are, especially when they benefit from you believing it.